The fire hose of news from America can feel like a lot these days.
If you're trying to figure out what to make of it all, we got you.
I'm Katie Simpson.
And I'm Paul Hunter. We're correspondents here in Washington,
working just around the corner from where much of the action is taking place.
2 blocks from the White House.
And that's the name of our new podcast.
For top-notch analysis of U.S. politics from a Canadian perspective, find 2 blocks from the White House every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts.
Including YouTube.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
One after the other, school boards across Ontario are being taken under government supervision, including some of the biggest, like Toronto and Peel District. Bill 33, the Supporting Children and Students Act, which was fast-tracked through the Ontario legislature at the end of last year, gives Education Minister Paul Calandra more control over school boards and the way classrooms are run. Now, it's also the bill that mandates local police involvement with schools through a school resource officer program, an initiative that has not been received well by parents and teachers across Ontario. In terms of the board takeovers, though, Minister Calandra says it's an attempt to fix what he deems financial mismanagement.
The ministry needs to have more authority to step into school boards that have gone off the rails. We have more than enough examples of that. And as I said way back in April, even those boards that were in a surplus position, if you're not running your board appropriately, we're going to step in and we're going to put you right on track. And I mean, I have no greater evidence than the fiasco that is the Near North District School Board and the chaos that is at that board. As I said at committee the other day, I don't think the minister should have to wait till the board is completely falling apart before he steps in.
But education critics are calling the government's bluff, claiming that the takeovers are a distraction from learning and more of a political power grab than the saving grace that the government is making it out to be. I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, we're digging into the why behind the more than half dozen school board takeovers and what the Ford government has in store for the future of education. First, I speak to my colleague Richard Southern, the Queen's Park reporter for 680 News Radio, to lay the groundwork for the past year in the Education Ministry. Then, I'm joined by Colin Matthew, Vice President of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, to talk more on what the impact has been like for teachers and students across the province. Richard Southern, thank you so much for joining me today.
That's great to be back here.
So take us back to the beginning of this school board obsession. What sparked the Ford government to have these boards on their radar initially?
I mean, it's unprecedented. I mean, we've never seen anything like this here at the Ontario Provincial Legislature. It really started when a new education minister took over last March. Paul Calandra is his name. He really has been on kind of a tear trying to get, he says, school boards in Ontario under control. He contends they've been mismanaged. He's pointed towards some what he says are financial mismanagement issues at the board. And so ever since he took the reins as education minister last year, Minister Calandra has placed 7 school boards now under supervision, meaning he's done away with a lot of their management structure. And it's in some cases him that's running the school boards, and in other cases he's appointed supervisors to run them. And so that's kind of what's happened here. We have a new education minister in the last year or so, and he's really gone after the heads of some of these school boards.
So what kind of sparked this? Because I know, last year there was that infamous trip to Italy, and there was, the purchase of all this art that kind of, made some headlines and I guess raised some alarm bells for some Ontarians. And I guess I think that's, a big story, I guess, that the Ontario government kind of clinged on to kind of be like, hey, look, like there is this mismanagement of funds. Take us through that. What happened at that time?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of concerning stories. There's no doubt about it, right? That there's certainly the education minister has a point here. I mean, in 2024, a group of school trustees from the Brantford, Haldimand, Norfolk County Catholic School Board, it's a mouthful, but it's a significant school board in Northern Ontario, they took a trip to Italy to buy, they say, art for a new school in their district. The trip cost $145,000. You know, you don't have to be any sort of education or political expert to look at that and say, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite right. 145,000 taxpayer dollars for trustees to fly off to Italy to buy art for a school. Yeah, I don't know about that. You know, there were other issues too, and at other school boards. The Thames Valley District School Board trustees there took a 3-day trip to Toronto for what they said was an administrative retreat. They stayed at the Rogers Centre during a Blue Jays game in one of those suites that you see in the outfield in the Blue Jay games that look out over the field. $40,000 for that trip. You know, and there were other issues at other school boards too about, you know, teachers that were about to get fired that the government wasn't happy about, and that's why they stepped in there. So there were a lot of these little things. I don't want to say little when you talk about 145,000, but there were issues, financial issues at some school boards that the government wanted to get a handle on.
You know, you mentioned off the top that we have 7 boards now under supervision. We may potentially have that 8th with your Catholic board. You know, what does this mean exactly? What does supervision entail? Is Paul Calandra himself going to these schools and showing face and shaking hands? What does that entail?
Yeah, in some cases, it is him making the decisions. But what he's really doing here with a lot of these boards is appointing a supervisor. And these supervisors, in many cases, don't have a lot or any experience in education. They're, you know, coming from the corporate sector in some cases or from the political realm, and they're being paid $350,000 a year to do this. So, you know, we've heard an earful from the opposition here at the Ontario Provincial Legislature about, hey, you know, is this really, you know, you're trying to tackle financial mismanagement, $145,000 trip to Italy, sure, but you're doing it by appointing a supervisor paid more than $300,000 a year. Is that the right way to do it? So that's kind of what the government's been doing here. But it's you know, raising a lot of criticism from the opposition.
Speaking of criticism, how has the community been reacting to these boards being picked up one after the other? I mean, what's been the overall public sentiment?
You know, I mean, I've talked to parents as I've reported on this story over the past year, and students too. And I've certainly heard a lot of concern from them. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the fact it's when you're talking about replacing heads of school boards and trustees, I mean, you're taking a lot away from voters, because these are democratically elected trustees in the province of Ontario that you go and you vote for when you're voting for your MPP. And the fact that the power is being taken out of their hands and is being placed without, you know, any say in the hands of the education minister or in the, you know, these high-paid supervisors, that doesn't sit well with a lot of these students and teachers I've talked to. They say, wait, we didn't, you know, ask for this. We don't like the way that this is unfolding. We feel, they tell me, Maria, that we don't have the type of say in this that we want to have. That's what I'm hearing.
And what about the opposition you mentioned there? You know, the opposition has been reacting to this. What have they been saying?
And we've heard sort of the same criticism, not only from the opposition, but also from a lot of the unions that represent teachers. And they're calling this a power grab. I mean, that's what they're calling it. They say, yeah, there's been some issues maybe of mismanagement, but they say the real issue is a lack of government funding for schools. I mean, the province, Maria, has set aside just over $30 billion for education this year, and they call that a record investment. But you know, others have looked at this, like, you know, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has looked at it, and they said that education funding, you know, when you look at inflation, you do all the math, they say it's actually dropped by some $1,500 per student since 2018. So when you talk about, like the education minister does, of the finances not being right at the schools, you know, the opposition say, well, that might have more to do with the fact that the government simply isn't spending enough on it. That's what we're hearing from them.
Now, what is the overall tone of the Ford government's stance on education? You know, we know Doug Ford himself is outwardly vocal about what he wants out of our education system and what he expects out of students in classrooms. What is their overall stance?
They put a lot of both political capital and funding into the skills trades, right? They want students to go into sectors that the government feels are in need. So, a lot of skilled trades. I mean, just this week, the Premier went after OSAP. This is the Government Assistance for Post-Secondary Students. And in sort of defending the changes, the fact that students in the post-secondary realm are now going to have to pay back these loans, and they used to be largely grants, now you're going to have to pay the money back. In defending that, Maria, the Premier said, well, there's too many students going into things like basket weaving, that he threw out as kind of a tongue-in-cheek example of, people not going into the quote-unquote right streams. So, I mean, that's kind of, they've really had a back-to-basic approach, like STEM, science, math, and reading. That's kind of what they've been focusing on. Critics say you kind of need a well-rounded education nowadays. That's not necessarily the way the Ford government's looking at it.
What is the Ford government's long game here, you think? As a Queen's Park reporter, what do you think their bigger picture is here?
There's certainly some political wins for them in going after these hot button issues. When you're talking about a taxpayer-funded trip to a luxury suite in the Rogers Centre, I mean, it can be viewed as a political win for the education minister to step in and say, hey, we're putting an end to that. That looks good, right? I mean, that's a win for them. I also think, they're looking to keep their eyes on the purse strings. This is a very big expenditure education for them. There's no doubt about that. So they want to, I think, make sure that all the dollars and cents are properly accounted for. You do look at some of the criticism, again, from the opposition and from the unions. They also point to the fact that maybe part of this has to do with the land that a lot of the schools sit on. Is it looking to take this land and do something else with it in schools that don't have high enrollment? I mean, this is a province, Ontario, that is facing a major housing crunch. That's an issue that has dogged the Ford government. Could the long game here be to maybe use some of the school land to build housing on? Who knows? That's kind of what the opposition suggests might be the long game here, Maria.
All right, Richard, thank you so much for breaking this angle down for us. I appreciate that.
Great to be here.
After the break, I'm joined by Colin Matthew, Vice President of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, to discuss what it's been like on the front lines as educators grapple with this new reality. Colin Matthew, Vice President of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here today.
We're almost a year into the Ford government coming in and taking that first school board under supervision at the beginning of, or I guess the middle of last year. And after that came this slew of other boards that were taken over by the Ford government at the call of Minister Calandra. What has it been like for teachers and educators within your union who now have to deal with this new major change in structure?
Yeah, it's been a significant disruption, I would say, to the processes that school boards normally follow. And this is something we've seen from the Ford government really since they came to power in 2018. We've seen very late release of funding numbers from one year to the next, which really throws school boards planning into disarray. We've seen significant funding reductions, despite the fact that the minister says over and over again that they're spending more than they ever have on education. He's accounting for inflation or allowing for inflation, I will say. In real dollars, we know that they're spending about $6.3 billion less than was being spent on K-12 education in 2018. And so when we roll all this together, it means that there are far fewer qualified adults in the schools than there were when the Ford government came to power, despite there being thousands more students in Ontario than there was then.
And speaking of the students, what has it been like for the students, on literally on the front lines of this?
They absolutely are. What we know is that the students find themselves in bigger classes. In grade 9, certainly de-streamed is one of the initiatives that the Ford government brought in. Minister Stephen Lecce introduced that, and it was discussed at that time as being an equity initiative to ensure that all students had access to the same outcomes coming out of high school. In reality, what it's meant for those kids is that they're in larger classes than they would have been before in many cases, and that those classes are heterogeneous in nature. It's much more difficult for the teacher to meet the needs of the individual students. And it's not just the class sizes, the ratio of students to teachers. We know there are far fewer supports in place than there have been in the past. There's lots of kids that need mental health supports in school from professional staff. There's students that need academic supports from various educational assistants or other services within the school. And we know that given budget restraints, those services are just far less available than they were 8 years ago when Ford first came to power.
I want to go back a little bit, to last year when we started seeing those takeovers of the schools. What was your reaction? What was the union's reaction? Did you see this coming?
We certainly know there's been tension, I would suggest, between the government and certain school boards, and we've seen some of that play out. There's very specific trustees in isolated cases that have made decisions that the public could certainly question, and that perhaps provided the excuse for the Ford government to step in and begin this process. We've seen the government use a variety of I'll call them excuses or reasons for taking over school boards. It seems to be a shifting target. Financial mismanagement or an inability to balance budgets was certainly one of the original reasons. We understand that has to be the case. When you strip out $6.3 billion, that's the only source of funding that school boards have. And so when their funding from the government is reduced over time and their costs continue to go up year on year, of course they can't balance budgets. And what we've seen in Ottawa Carleton, which was one of the boards that was taken over last fall, the supervisor has had no greater success balancing the budget than the trustees have because there's simply inadequate funding being provided to meet the obligations of the school board. This is a board where buses regularly don't run because there aren't enough bus drivers under contract. And so we've seen all kinds of related problems as funding pinches are felt at the local level. So I would suggest that the chaos has been kind of cover to continue this initiative. We've seen in urban centers, especially in Toronto and Ottawa, we've seen the supervisors take an interest in or make significant changes to the way school board lands are administered and managed. The Ottawa Carleton District School Board at this point has several properties that are now up for sale, something that hadn't been entertained prior to the takeover. The Toronto Lands Corporation, which is the part of the Toronto District School Board that manages the property holdings of that school board, those meetings have been moved behind closed doors so the public can't attend and can't see what's transpiring in those meetings. So certainly this has been part of a pattern of the Ford government where we see that they have a great interest in getting their hands on public lands with the possibility of private development. So we believe that's part of it. But really overall, I think, Maria, it's the distraction from the chaos that the underfunding has really created. And you already talked about the student experience, and that's the crying shame of it all, really.
Yeah, I think that the crux of this takeover or of these takeovers, is that funding piece. And, Paul Calandra maintains that the reason that he's stepping in and he wants to act as this overlord of all these boards is that, again, that mismanagement of funds. And of course, they really clung on to that Italy trip last year and, that artwork and that was purchased and the numbers were big, they weren't really they weren't arguable. What do you make of his reason being that mismanagement of funds?
Certainly, locally elected trustees have the community's best interest at heart. They understand the community better than anyone at Queen's Park could possibly understand it. Many of them have kids in the system or have had kids in the system locally. And so the locally elected trustees has been the backbone of public education in Ontario really since its inception. And we strongly believe that that's the best way to administer schools, to be responsive to those local community needs. What works in Toronto may or may not work in Timmins and so on and so forth. I don't need to work my way across the whole province, obviously, but Ontario is a big place. Our communities have very diverse needs. The demographics are not similar. The socioeconomic conditions in a given community are not similar. The geography is not similar. And so we do believe that locally elected trustees are the best interface between the community, the parents, the students, and the school board. And the best way is to ensure that those locally elected trustees have access to a budget that supports the needs of that community to fully fund public education effectively. And with the loss of that $6.3 billion, it's a massive loss per student. When you look at the ability of the boards to provide student services, what we're seeing is, as I say, supervisors being put in place, making changes. In at least 2 cases, the supervisor has changed the director of education. So senior management's being changed out in favor of a political appointee. And again, in the case of Ottawa Carleton, to come back to where I'm joining you from today, the director of education for the first time is not an educator by background or by training. You've got a professional manager running at this point the Ottawa Carleton District School Board.
What is the role of a school board or a trustee? I guess taking the politics out of it, what is that role that is so crucial here?
That's a great question. I really think it's part of what's gotten lost in this whole conversation. So that the trustees really are the interface between the school board management, which are in one fashion or another really employees of the Minister of Education, and the local community. So the trustees are locally elected. Their job is to be publicly available to parents, publicly available to community members who have concerns or questions about education in their own communities. Trustees are elected by ward, very similar to city councilors or town councilors. And so each local area has a trustee who is a local person, a familiar face, somebody that's publicly accountable to them and is further accountable every couple of years at election time. Whereas what the Ministry of Education sees replacing trustees, what they've moved ahead with in Toronto and in other areas as well, are offices of student and parent services. And so there's essentially an email address or a website where parents can log on, they can register their complaint, and some number of bureaucratic staff on some certain timeline will get back to parents, I guess, as the concerns are raised. What we hear from trustees, and we've had a significant number of conversations with the displaced trustees across the province, here in Ottawa, as well as in Toronto and others, and these trustees are really raising their concerns. What they tell us is that they were receiving dozens or hundreds of reach outs from parents week by week, month by month. And so now these dozens, hundreds, and in bigger centers, thousands of reach outs by parents are going to an anonymous email address or to an anonymous phone number to be addressed by a bureaucrat who isn't accountable to the public, who doesn't necessarily represent the local interests or have local knowledge.
You know, Minister Calandra has been open about his wish to essentially abolish elected trustees overall, following suit from Nova Scotia and Quebec. You know, in your opinion, how would a complete government takeover impact local democracy?
It would eliminate it effectively. It gives sweeping control to the government, an ability to make decisions over school buildings that aren't necessarily reflective of the community. We've already talked a little bit about school properties, to sell properties off to private interests or for other purposes. One of the things the minister talked about when we last heard from him directly was that he had the ability to reassign school buildings from one sector to another. So he can take a Catholic school and he can turn it into a public school if he feels like it, or vice versa. So it would give unprecedented and direct public control to folks at Queen's Park who really don't have any training or expertise in the administration of education across the province.
You know, the Ford government has been open about what its wishes are for education in Ontario. You know, their Back to Basics campaign and even Ford's comments the other day about so-called basket weaving courses. I mean, they are very outward about what they perceive education should be like. Keeping the Ford government's tone in mind, what do you wish they knew about education and students in Ontario?
What I really wish is that they would take a look at the conditions in schools and not the select few that they choose to visit, and certainly not the private schools that they often choose to visit. That was certainly Stephen Lecce's favorite backdrop, were private schools. I really wish they would spend some time in Ontario's public schools. I really wish they would talk to parents, however those parents vote, whatever their political stripe, and really seek to understand the needs of communities. What we know is that expenditure on education is in fact an investment in Ontario's future. We have independent research that suggests that $1 invested in public education returns more than $1.30 to the province. That's in the better healthcare outcomes, less reliance on social services, less reliance on the criminal justice system. So it's a long-term investment. We know that as Ontario seeks to remain competitive, not just with the U.S., but on the global stage as well, that broad-based education is going to be important to it. And I will say, I'll put in a plug for those basket weaving courses that the Premier talked about. A lot of those liberal arts type courses are the things that produce big thinkers, creative thinkers, global thinkers that we need as we continue to push into this modern age. So, of course, we need tradespeople, we need hands-on, we need folks in all walks of life, and we need folks with all abilities and skill sets to be able to access the education they need to be productive members. And some of that is going to be that basket weaving stuff that the Premier was very quick to deride. Quite disappointingly, I'll say. To suggest from a Premier who has risen on family wealth that folks don't deserve OSAP grants or an ability to access higher education is frankly a shameful statement, and it really throws a huge swath of Ontario's students under the bus or leaves them without the opportunity to pursue higher education. So I found that comment very distasteful and quite disappointing.
Colin, I'm curious to know, do you have any trust in the Ontario government at this point in terms of their vision for education, or at least in the interim with these takeovers? We know that that one takeover of, I think it was the Peel board. I have to double check it. It was either the Peel board or the Peel Dufferin, and Mr. Minister Calandra essentially said that they halted the termination of 60 teachers. Do you think there's any silver lining at all in this, or have you lost hope?
I don't have a lot of faith in this government because I don't necessarily believe that their interests align with the interests of public education. What we've seen in education and in healthcare, both from this government, and it really has been an aggressive agenda that they've pursued since 2018, is really a privatization agenda. And the privatization playbook is quite simple. We've seen it play out in lots of different jurisdictions. We saw it play out in Ontario under the Harris years. We've seen it play out in the United States, in the United Kingdom as well. And that privatization playbook generally starts with breaking the publicly available service such that the public begins to lose faith in that service as well. And the easiest way to break public education or public healthcare is to underfund it. So we've seen in healthcare specifically, we've seen emergency rooms closing. I live normally in Lindsay, Ontario, and emergency room in Minden, not far from me, permanently closed about a year ago. And so those folks have lost access to frontline healthcare. We see that ERs are closed on a rotating basis. And we see a lot of the same in schools as well. This move, this desire by the government to have students doing virtual learning online, not necessarily provided by a public provider or by public schools. And so we see, I think, what is a privatizing agenda from this government. And so I don't have a lot of faith at this point that they're committed to the same goals that we're committed to, which unequivocally is universal, accessible public education for all students of Ontario, where they can receive an outstanding world-class education in order to achieve their full potential.
All right, Colin, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I very much appreciate your interest in the story, and I really hope that the public will continue to engage with the government on this and let them know that they're going down the wrong path, and there's going to be some political resistance at the public level. So thank you very much.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your feedback on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or find us on Blue Sky at The Big Story. If you know someone that might enjoy this episode, feel free to send it to them. New episodes publish every morning, Monday through Friday, and don't miss our weekend listens. The Big Story is produced by me, Maria Kestane. Diana Kay is the head of strategy and content. Desi Nair is the manager of podcast operations. Dylan McGuire is our associate producer. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.